Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, today we are going to discuss the evolution of Indian society. We will try to understand the different aspects of Indian society and how it evolved over the years. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio senior academician Dr. S.S. Jotka. He is currently professor of sociology in Jawaharlal Nehru University, a premier institution of the country, and he has written a number of books and regularly contribute on different forum on the topic of different topic on sociology. So I think his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic and will give insight how to understand the Indian society. So on your behalf, I welcome him for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Society is in some sense very obvious term, but it's also a very difficult concept. It's not something which is easy to define. When we think of society in sociology, we generally think of society as a network of social relationships, a system of social institutions and values which keeps a particular society going. All societies, when they become societies, imply that human beings, individuals, live together, and when they live together, they follow a particular way of life. There's a particular pattern in which they behave, and that behavior is, in a sense, largely governed by the given social structure or social institutions. And these social structures, these social institutions also make it easy for others to predict what the other person is going to say. So there are certain norms and values and patterns of behavior which remain common across communities, across time. Some of them also change. Societies almost everywhere in the world, wherever a society exists, if it is a society, it would have certain system of social relations, certain institutions, certain ways of life. So in some sense, as human beings, we all live with other human beings. So we live in the human society, and in the present day times, we also have a kind of globalization where we interact with people from different parts of the world, and this interaction goes on continuously. It may not be face to face, but in many different ways. For example, we access popular media through television channels, through internet, through personal communications. People also go to study in different parts of the world. They travel for business. They also travel for jobs and stuff like that. So when we think of societies like Indian society, these are kind of historically evolved concept. There's nothing obvious about Indian society. The way we understand Indian society, we tend to assume that Indian society has always been the way it is now. But the fact is that the way we think about ourselves as Indians, as part of this larger territorial entity called India, and therefore we have certain common values, certain common kind of cultural traits or certain institutions which makes us Indian. But this fact also has historically evolved. For example, society in the 15th or 14th century in this region today called India or South Asia was very different. The units were very different. There were different regions, and these regions in a sense defined the territory within which people lived their life. Even now, most Indians, for example, would live in a small area of this country called India, but we travel across the country without any hesitation, without having to require passports, without any restriction. We can also take up jobs, and many of us travel. In India, the number of people who travel today is much larger. As a country, we also have a common constitution, and this constitution is a kind of set of values. It imbibes all those aspirations and values around which the people who fought for India's independence tried to put the values by which we need to kind of work together. So Constitution of India, in a sense, is a codification of the modern values of Indian society. So when we think of Indian society, we tend to invoke of traditions. We tend to think of India's past, how India has evolved from its past. But this past is invariably an imagined past. This is also constructed. It is constructed by the way certain people want India to be. The nationalist leaders, in a sense, invented a past for India, that this is what constitutes India and this is what is perhaps not India. So these boundaries were historically drawn, and over the years they have become part of our common sense. So today India is a reality. India is reality as a nation state, but apart from nation state, we also have a kind of Indian society with certain kind of boundaries, with certain kind of common values which we cherish as people of India. For example, democracy is one of them. We do have preamble of Indian Constitution, which in a sense again states the values of Indian society, but we also have other values which are not necessarily part of the Indian Constitution or which are not really modern values. There are institutions which are seen as quite essentially Indian institutions. For example, the question of caste system, or the kind of village society we have in India is perhaps different from settlements in other parts of the world. Inequality that is structured around caste system in India is different from other part of the world. But I think let's first begin by identifying historically how has the idea of India evolved. The manner in which we understand ourselves as India is not something which has always been there, and in some sense it is a product of the 20th century. And the 20th century, when India becomes independence in 1947, and then our leaders evolve a constitution, in a sense brings us together as a people, and then we begin to, in a sense, large majority of Indians begin to think together in more or less in the same manner, and this is how we want to build our new society. As I said, if one was to think of society from a kind of structural perspective, which would look at the way societies are organized at a given period of time, all societies are similar because all societies have certain kind of structures. There are social relations are woven around certain institutions like family, like the state system, like judiciary, like universities, like village settlements, like urban settlements, and they make up for that particular kind of society. And since the 20th century, the whole world is organized around the idea of nation state. So the societies have become in some sense national societies. They are societies which are part of the nation state. When we think of India, or people who have talked about Indian society in social sciences, or historians who have conceptualized the idea of India, they tend to identify different phases in the history of Indian society. And when we think about the contemporary Indian society, or India as an imagination, the way we identify ourselves as Indians today, the most critical element or process in our history has been the establishment of the British colonial rule. This part of the world was never stable, in the sense that there were people coming from outside, there were people going from here to outside. For example, there are people of Indian origin in different parts of the world, in Africa, in Fiji, in some other parts of the world also, people who migrated from here even before the British colonial rule. So there was a lot of movement. There was no stable identity as we understand India in the sense in which it has evolved as a nation state. So the establishment of British colonial rule marked the beginning of a new phase, because the Britishers introduced some structural changes, basic changes in Indian society. When the rulers came from outside earlier, they settled down here, and when they settled down here, they adapted to the local culture and traditions, local system of cultivation, local system of collecting revenue from land, rather than imposing their own systems in a radical way. The Britishers were, in a sense, alien, in the sense that they came from very far off areas and they did not really understand India very easily initially. and they had different kinds of interests because of their own interests in Britain. There were other Europeans also who came to India, and some of them continued to rule certain parts of India, like in Goa we had Portuguese, in Pondicherry we had French, and similarly there were some other pockets where other foreigners were in a sense rulers. But most significant in Indian history has been the rule by the British colonial rulers. What is it that the Britishers did to India which transformed India in a very fundamental way, and not always positively? In many ways British colonial rule also had very serious negative implications, but sociologically speaking or politically speaking, the implication of British rule were very, very significant. As we know, the Britishers came here as traders, as East India Company, and East India Company gradually, in a sense, took over the reins of certain parts of India after the Battle of Plassey in the second half of 18th century. I will not go into the history. What I am going to discuss today is the structural changes that the British colonial rule brought about Indian society, and how they are significant the way we understand contemporary India in the present day context. The first and foremost changes that British rulers introduced in India was the introduction of new kind of land systems. Now, land is something which was very significant. It continues to be very significant in case of India. Most of the people drew their livelihood from agriculture, and agriculture was something which was the source of income for Indians and source of income or attraction for the foreigners also. When the Britishers established their rule, they wanted to collect the tax that earlier rulers were collecting from the peasants, which were local Indian peasants. And in order to, in some sense, make it more effective, they introduced new systems of land revenue, which are called as land settlements. Now, they tried a variety of systems in different parts of the subcontinent, but everywhere they introduced permanent or regular kind of ownership rights, the kind of rights that were not common to Indian society. We have had private property. India also had its own system of identifying who owns land and who doesn't own land, its own system of hierarchies in rural areas, but land was still, in a sense, a communitarian property. People owned land and it was transferred to their families, but they did not look at land as a commodity. It was not something which was sold and bought in the market. Similarly, even though peasants produced more than what they required, but agriculture was primarily for own consumption. So what Britishers did was that they introduced a kind of private property in agriculture, that land was transferred to individuals and individuals became owners of the land because they wanted to collect revenue in cash. And this, in a sense, system of collecting revenue, land revenue as cash, had far-reaching implications for the Indian agriculture. Gradually, with time, we also see another change that happens in the relationship between the British rulers and Indians, because we experience or Britain experiences industrial revolution in their own society. With the success of industrial revolution, the capacity to produce industrial goods goes up significantly. And for production of industrial goods, for example cloth, they also want raw materials. So where are they going to procure this raw material? India was one of the colonies, and they encouraged the local peasants to switch over from cash crops to the production of cotton. So when the peasants started producing cotton, cotton was produced for the British market, for the British cloth mills, and this again had far-reaching implications. When something is produced for the foreign market, that means the land is being used for something else and not for production of cereals or food grains, rice and wheat, which was eaten locally. At another level, it also brings about a kind of commercialization of agriculture. So agriculture, instead of catering to the needs of common people, local people, the producers, becomes a commercial activity. And this commercialization of agriculture also integrates Indian agriculture into the global market. So what happens elsewhere has implications for India. So agriculture was one area which in a sense was transformed by the Britishers, and the implications of this integration of agriculture in the colonial economy were very negative, in the sense that Indian agriculture actually experiences a kind of backwardness, and it becomes less productive over the years. But it also brings about changes in Indian agriculture which have implications for the later mobilization of Indian peasants by people like Gandhi. More importantly, or equally important, was the introduction of new things in India by the British rulers. For example, because they wanted to import things from here, export things from here, and import the Britishers' goods to India for Indians, they also set up big cities, cities that were on the seashore. For example, cities like Chennai or Madras, as it was known earlier, or Calcutta, which was the first big city, or Bombay. All these were cities from where you could take out, say, things like cotton and bring things from outside for India. But that led to a new kind of urban culture, new kind of urbanization. New urban centers were established. There were cities in existence in earlier also in India, but you have these new cities like Bombay, like Madras, which is now called Chennai, or Calcutta, which emerged during the colonial period. Along with the introduction of new colonial cities, we also have the introduction of new kind of industry in India, because after industrial revolution becomes successful in Britain, they also want to integrate India into the colonial empire. So the Britishers set up, for example, railways in India in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and these railways also lead to the development of modern kind of factories, modern factory system. In cities like Surat and Bombay, you have modern mills which were mostly there in the British kind of land, also begin to be set up in India. Also other kind of infrastructure, modern infrastructure, which made things very different. For example, printing press, or the postal system, or the other kind of transport system. India has had history of road networks, but these road networks were improved during this period. Another very important change that comes about in India during, or in this region during that period, because of the land revenue system, because of the introduction of private property in land, because of the kind of disputes that are emerging over land, the Britishers also introduce a new kind of legal system. And this legal system, in a sense, provides a different kind of framework for dealing with disputes. Not only dealing with disputes, it also provides a framework for claiming ownership rights over land, that agricultural land can be owned by somebody and can be sold in the market like any other commodity. And that again has its own implication. Things like press or mass media or postal system also play a very important role in integrating this whole region into, in a sense, increasingly one unit. People could communicate with each other from one place to the other, which was earlier not possible. Things like telegraph, or later on also, in a sense, telephones and railways obviously make transportation very easy. And gradually the railway network was laid all across the subcontinent. A very important system that Britishers introduced in India was the introduction of new secular kind of education. Again, like most other things, education was also not alien to India. Formal education was part of our culture, but it was confined only to certain privileged section of the people. Within the Hindu caste system, only certain categories of people could gain education, while others were not allowed to get themselves educated. So education was a privilege only of the few. The introduction of secular education or modern education made it possible for everyone to go to schools, technically speaking. Not that everyone could go to school because of the inequalities and poverties and other kind of problems, but there was still a kind of new education system, and those who went to these schools and colleges and universities which were opened by the Britishers, they also became employees of the colonial empire. They were the local babus. So the idea was to have local people in the governance systems, in the state system of Britishers, who would be Indians as such, but would think like the Britishers. So they were taught colonial education the way Britishers thought of education, and gradually all these people began to work in government departments. Some of them became lawyers, some of them went to study further in British universities, and there emerged a new kind of Indian middle class. And the emergence of this middle class was a very, very significant development in the history of contemporary India, because it is this middle class which in a sense begins to, before anyone else, imagine themselves as possibly members of one national community called India. Most of these people were not really middle class. They were actually from privileged families. They almost all of them came from upper caste or privileged families. They were mostly urban to begin with. Their parents were also kind of well off, and that's how they could go abroad. There were very rare cases like Ambedkar, who was able to raise a scholarship, who could go and study in Columbia or in London, but most of them were poor people, most of them were privileged people. And these privileged people, when they went abroad to study, they also experienced racism and other kind of discrimination of the British rulers. Somebody like Gandhi experiences discrimination in Britain, and then he goes to South Africa, and South Africa is again a society which is racially divided, at that time very sharply divided between blacks and whites and browns. So all of them begin to, in a sense, think of themselves as Indians and people who are colonized. Before that, the whole idea of colonization, the fact that foreigners are ruling over us, wasn't really something that people thought about it, because people lived in their small rural settlements and rulers came, rulers went. It mattered to them, but they couldn't really imagine of themselves being anything different. So rulers were anyway outsiders always, and now these are the people who can connect with each other. They are all educated in English language, they are all more or less of similar kind of skin color, they are all part of the colonial British Empire called India, and India, the term itself, was being popularized by the Britishers, and when they were ruling over India, they were also writing about India. They were preparing texts for people who wanted to know about India in their own countries. They were writing about India because they wanted to understand different regions of India, different languages of India, so that they could govern India in a better way. By the later half of the 19th century, they also start enumerating populations in India, a colonial census through which communities are classified, and so they need a system of knowledge. So this system of knowledge becomes available also to these middle class Indians who are studying in different parts of the Western world. Now these middle class Indians, who have a common kind of background in the sense that they went to a secular educational system developed by the Britishers, they have a new language to communicate with each other, that is English. Unlike the earlier period, somebody who is growing up in Odisha will speak only Odia, somebody is growing up in the present day Haryana would speak the local dialect of Hindi or Haryanvi, somebody who is growing up in Tamil Nadu will not be able to communicate with any one of them, but these are people who can talk to each other. Not only can they talk to each other, they also, in a sense, inhabit a common space. For example, many of them become lawyers because of the new judicial system introduced by the Britishers. You need legal services. So if you are a lawyer, you have to deal with the same kind of legal systems. And you also end up meeting each other because you have common occupation, or you become a doctor. So you went to a kind of common medical college, maybe somewhere in Britain, but you also communicate with each other because you have common problems, common kind of patients. And this communication becomes possible because of the availability of postal system. You can also write about your experience in newspapers. So there's a new kind of imagination, there's a new kind of thinking that begins to take shape in the 19th century in India, and this leads to emergence of what are called as social reforms. And these social reforms are very significant in many different ways because they begin to also think of India through different kind of categories which are part of the modern world or the Western world, that India or India's religions, India's family, India's kinship, India's education should be like what you have in the Western countries. So you have this new theories of social evolution, social Darwinism, which also begin to become popular in this part of the world. So this middle class gradually grows in size, and as it grows in size, its coming together, its interaction with each other also begins to become very, very significant. And it is in this sphere that a new idea of India begins to take shape, and they begin to meet each other. The formation of Indian National Congress, which led to the emergence of a nationalist movement in India, in a sense, is located in this kind of dialectics of process, as social scientists have argued. Now this middle class gradually begins to imagine about India as a possible nation state, also as a state which has common social values, common culture, common politics, common interests and common agenda, right? So gradually this middle class begins to think of establishing a state called India, a nation state called India, an independent India. And that's where the idea of nationalism or freedom struggle begins to take shape. And this freedom struggle is not articulating only political ideas or political aspirations. Through social reform movements which start in the late 19th century and take off in the early 20th century, there is also a process of imagining Indian society. What kind of family life do we want to have? What kind of status of women should be there in a country called India? What kind of divisions, whether we accept untouchability or not, whether we accept caste system or not, whether we accept child marriage or not, all these things become issues. So gradually this middle class is able to expand itself both vertically as well as horizontally. By horizontal expansion, I mean that people like them begin to come around. So the number of people who are part of this small group of people initially thinking about India begins to grow. So even from smaller towns, people begin to travel because travel has become possible. They also start newspapers of their own. These newspapers begin to get read, and people like them begin to read those newspapers, sometime in English, but also in local languages gradually. So there is a kind of horizontal expansion of the middle class. But this middle class, interestingly, is able to expand vertically also. By vertical expansion, I mean that they are able to connect with other classes and categories of people in India. For example, when Gandhi comes back to India, he is not talking only about urban Indians. He is not talking only about middle class Indians. He wants to talk about the whole of India. And he says that the whole of India doesn't live in cities. The whole of India is not educated in English. The whole of India is not really experiencing discrimination, the kind of experience we have had because we have traveled abroad. So he begins to talk about rural people. He begins to talk about the village society. And Gandhi is not the only person. Nehru also discovers India. He writes his book called Discovery of India while he is sitting in jails or in libraries. And while writing about Discovery of India, he begins to relate to other classes of India, people who are poor, people who are living in rural areas, people who are suffering because of colonial policies of land alienation and stuff like that. There are famines, there is starvation. So they begin to relate to these classes. With industrialization, even in urban areas, you have a gradual growth of a kind of working class in India, people who are not middle class, but who are urban, who live in cities but are workers. And these workers also begin to relate to the idea of India in many different ways. So Gandhi was very successful in mobilizing the peasants around the idea of independent India, around the idea of a free country. So when these people come together, vertically and horizontally, you have the emergence of a kind of common national imagination. And this national imagination, in a sense, translates into what we call as the freedom movement. And this freedom movement then gradually develops into what we call as the Indian society today. Not directly, but gradually with the process of evolution, once we have achieved independence, independence doesn't come on its own. For that, people have to mobilize themselves. When they mobilize themselves, they also begin to relate to each other. They begin to understand each other. They begin to communicate with each other. Right? Language continues to be a very serious problem, but there are still translations possible. English begins to become more popular. In some areas, there is a process of standardization of Hindi. Regional languages also begin to grow because there is a new regional elite because of new printing press. Written words become much more popular. So people can read each other's writings. There are new newspapers which were published begin to be published in local languages also, though this is something which expands much later. But this horizontal and vertical expansion of the idea of India happens in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, and then gradually by the middle of the 20th century, India has become an independent nation state. Now, independence of India was also marked by a major crisis, right? As we know, partition of India was not something which was desirable and which in a sense proved that the idea of India was not a very strong idea, because when these people were talking about India, they were not talking about India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. They were talking about one common India because everyone had common experience. Religion was important for the people in this region, but religion was to remain as a source of diversity. The idea was to overcome those diversities around the idea of India, and that in a sense could not really materialize for various reasons, partly because of the colonial policies of reifying these kind of communitarian identities into religious groups, partly also because of the failures of the movement, freedom movement and various other factors. And we had partition of India, or partition of the subcontinent, and instead of one country, we had two countries initially, and later on they became three countries. Now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh share many common points, but if we look at them as societies, over the past 60 years and more, they have also evolved very differently. India today is in a sense a society in its own right, and its boundaries correspond with the national boundaries because we have a common constitution. And this constitution gives us a new kind of tradition, new kind of imagination about ourselves. And that imagination is not shared by countries in the neighborhood. Pakistan has its own constitution, which gives itself another kind of imagination, which is different from the kind of imagination that India has. Not that India and Pakistan cannot be friends, they should be friends, but they are also different countries now. They have evolved very differently. What is so unique about India? What is it that makes India India? What is it that distinguishes us from Sri Lanka or from Britain or from Pakistan or from Russia or from any other country in the world? Obviously, there are local realities, and these local realities have their own histories. Histories go back, far back in the past, but they also don't go very far back, right? For example, as we were just discussing, the making of Indian Constitution is the point where India can claim to be a new kind of society, right? But as far as people living here are concerned, their traditions, their values, their ethnic way of life, their food cultures, their religions go far back in past, right? And that in a sense is very diverse. So one of the most important feature of what we call as the Indian society is its diversity. There is perhaps no other country in the world which is defined by diversity. There is no single common dominant culture which can be called as the mainstream culture in India. You talk about one thing, immediately there are internal diversities within that particular kind of. There is no language group. For example, people now say that Hindi speaking people are the largest in number in India and Hindi should become a national language. But the fact is that we have 18 plus languages which are recognized by the government of India as recognized Indian languages, right?
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. We have a call from Himachal Pradesh. Good afternoon, friend. Please ask your question.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. Please ask your question.
Sir, actually, I have a question that that India is partitioned between India and Pakistan. But what is the reason behind the partition of India and Bangladesh?
So Bangladesh was part of Pakistan. In 1947, Pakistan had two parts. One was called Eastern Pakistan and the other one was Western Pakistan, because division was on religious lines, two nation theory as the Muslim League wanted. So these were the areas where Muslims were in large majority. So the present day Bangladesh then becomes a separate country, partitions itself from Pakistan on language lines in 1971. But at that time, Bangladesh was also part of Pakistan.
Okay, so one region may be the language, the other there are several other regions that interplay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So these are in some sense failures of the leadership. Partition of India was in a sense a failure of India's leadership. If leadership was smart, they should have been able to work out. And it has not been good for anyone. It's not been good for India, it's not been good for Pakistan. Partition led to the death of hundreds and thousands of people. Those who had to migrate, there was a serious crisis.
We have another call from Uttar Pradesh. Good afternoon, friend. Please ask your question. Go ahead, please ask your question.
हेलो
जी, सवाल पूछिए.
हाँ हेलो सर, मेरा सवाल है.
जी.
हेलो, सुन पा रहे हैं आप?
जी जी, सुन रहे हैं. सवाल पूछिए.
हाँ, मेरा सवाल ये है सर, ये जो कास्ट सिस्टम है इंडिया में, क्या ये बांग्लादेश, श्रीलंका और नेपाल, पाकिस्तान में भी है?
बहुत अच्छा सवाल है आपने पूछा. कास्ट सिस्टम पूरे रीजन में एग्जिस्ट करता है. बांग्लादेश में भी है, पाकिस्तान में भी है, किसी हद तक श्रीलंका में भी है और नेपाल में भी है. कुछ और भी कंट्रीज हैं जो इस रीजन के, वहां पे भी कास्ट सिस्टम एग्जिस्ट करता है. लेकिन इंडिया और बांग्लादेश और कुछ और कंट्रीज में इसको ऑफिशियली भी रिकॉग्नाइज किया गया है. बाकी जगह पे उस तरह से रिकॉग्नाइज नहीं किया गया, इसलिए उसके लिए कोई अच्छे से पॉलिसी नहीं बनाए. इंडिया ने रिजर्वेशन सिस्टम बनाया जैसे, ताकि जो लोग लोअर डाउन हायरार्की में थे उनके लिए भी लेवल प्लेइंग फील्ड हो सके. तो इंडिया का कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन जो है उसने एक कोशिश की है कि ताकि इक्वालिटी आ सके इंडियन सोसाइटी में. बट पाकिस्तान में भी कास्ट डिवीजन ऐसे ही है जैसे इंडिया में है.
ओके. एक और सवाल है उत्तर प्रदेश से. जी नमस्कार, सवाल पूछिए.
नमस्ते सर.
जी सवाल.
सर, माय क्वेश्चन इज दैट Britishers rule in India, that's why in the indigenous people have the colonial mindset, and this colonial mindset is lacking behind, and it is a negative aspect for the nation. So give some through light on this topic.
Okay. Yeah, by colonial mindset we mean like the rulers are not part of us, right? Because colonial rulers were foreigners, and unfortunately after India's independence we have kept that kind of colonial culture. The way, for example, our bureaucracy or some of our leaders behave as if they are rulers, they are colonial masters, and we are common people who have to be subservient to them like they are our colonial masters. While the fact is that today India is a democracy. if we have bureaucracy, bureaucrats are by definition, they are called civil servants. They should be serving society as service providers, as their servants, but they become lords. They begin to behave like they are the rulers and we are the subjects, like we have been colonized by them. So there is this colonial mindset which is there in the Indian elite, which doesn't recognize that common Indians are also common Indians equal. So everyone in India is equal. Our constitution, as it was framed, it gives absolutely equal rights to everyone. There's nobody who is privileged, right? People have a lot of money, they are richer, so they can have those advantages as rich person, but as human being, everyone is equal. As far as my dignity is concerned, your dignity is concerned, somebody who works on the roadside, there's absolutely no inequality. That is the idea of citizenship. But somehow we have not been able to institutionalize or make it into a kind of effective idea, and that's where India needs to progress, and that's something which people are beginning to recognize, and that's why there's so much of pressure on political system.
Okay, we have call from Odisha. Good afternoon, friend. Please ask your question.
हेलो
जी.
हाँ, प्रश्न करना था सबसे.
Yeah, go ahead. Please ask your question.
हाँ जी
सवाल पूछिए.
सर, जैसा कि सर ने बताया कि इंडिपेंडेंस के समय में लीडरशिप में कुछ कमियां थी, और आज भी लगभग ऐसा ही लीडरशिप है, तो ऐसे लीडर को जनता क्यों समझती है, क्यों उसको लाइक करती है? इसका सोशियोलॉजिकल क्या आंसर हो सकता है?
ये हमारे यहाँ जो सोशियोलॉजिकल चर्निंग हो रही है, हमें जब दूर से बैठ के देखते हैं तो लगता है कुछ बदला नहीं है, लेकिन जब आप पास में जाके देखते हैं लीडरशिप प्रोसेस को, लीडरशिप इज ऑल्सो वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग सोशियोलॉजिकल प्रोसेस, एंड देयर इज अ प्रोसेस ऑफ चर्निंग. आप देखिए पिछले 50 साल में इतना चेंज हुआ है इंडिया में. अभी जो लीडर है उसको ही हैज टू बी ऑल द टाइम अकाउंटेबल, and in different ways people are changing, and that change is visible and in some sense also obvious.
ये भी कह सकते हैं कि कमियां व्यक्तिगत तौर पर नहीं बल्कि परिस्थिति के
precisely ये प्रोसेस है
और परिस्थिति क्या डिमांड करती है, उसमें क्या एक्शन होना चाहिए.
लेकिन बदलाव हो रहा है, चेंज आ रहा है, बहुत
तो
इफेक्टिव चेंज आ रहा है.
दिल्ली से दर्शक हैं, उनका सवाल लेते हैं. जी नमस्कार, सवाल पूछिए.
हेलो सर. हेलो
जी, सवाल पूछिए.
माय क्वेश्चन इज हाउ इंडिया इज इंडियन सोसाइटी इज we can say a post-colonial society, or how can we say India is a post-colonial society?
Post-colonial
society.
Okay, how can we say that India is a post-colonial society?
पोस्ट-colonial अपने आप में एक टेक्निकल वर्ड है, उसको रहने दीजिए. लेकिन अब colonial रूल उस तरह से नहीं रहा जैसे पहले था. One can always argue that we are part of the global empire, which is in a sense following more or less the same logic.
Okay.
But in reality, India has its own political system. India has its own economic system. Indian political system has significant autonomy. But you are right. There is a larger global power structure. For example, our currency is evaluated by global financial system, and that has a lot of implications on the way we relate to rest of the world. So at some level, you have a point, but then the change is also very significant.
Okay. तो मित्रों, इन्हीं शब्दों के साथ आज के व्याख्यान को यहीं विराम देते हैं. कल हम लोग और चर्चा करेंगे दूसरे विषय पर, लाइब्रेरी रिसोर्सेज को कैसे यूज करें अपने ज्ञान को बढ़ाने के लिए. लाइब्रेरी में क्या कौन कौन से आजकल जो डायरेक्टली आप जा सकते हैं ऑनलाइन रिसोर्स है, उस पर बात करेंगे. तो आप सबको धन्यवाद, और आपकी ओर से डॉक्टर SS ज्योतिका को भी बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, जिन्होंने काफ़ी सरल भाषा में हम लोगों को कैसे भारतीय समाज ओवर द ईयर्स इवॉल्व हुआ है उसके बारे में समझाने की कोशिश की. थैंक यू वेरी मच.